We are once again at one of those hinge moments of history. Our old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increasing integration, is over. The system of open global trade anchored by the United States, a system that Canada has relied on since the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped deliver prosperity for a country for decades, is over.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. The news overnight from Canada is already being interpreted/misinterpreted by the media. Some people are calling it a huge comeback for centrism or liberalism, a reaction against Donald Trumpism. And yes, certainly the change from earlier opinion polls just a few months ago is very dramatic. But is it the triumph that they will have you believe? We are joined, I'm delighted to say, by Michael Ignatieff, someone who really knows his onions on this topic, not only a writer, academic, long-time observer, but actually former leader of the Canadian Liberals between 2008 and 2011. He's now at the Central European University in Vienna. Welcome to UnHerd, Michael.
Nice to be here.
So what's your kind of top-line takeaway? Do you share my view that it's not quite a triumph, or what should we be thinking first of all this morning?
I think first of all, it's a reaction across the country to Trump and to his threats to the sovereignty and economic future of the country. It's a vote also, I think, for political stability. People were impressed by the fact that this guy had run a central bank in Britain and had run a central bank in Canada and had been in two huge epical economic crises, Brexit on the one hand and the 2008 meltdown. And I think that convinced them to go with a party that otherwise I think they were going to throw out. Whether it has the larger implications that you're suggesting, which is that it's a victory for liberalism and centralism, I just think we don't know. Canada's Canada. It's not Britain. It's not France. It's sui generis because we sit beside this gigantic economy. It's always determined a lot of what's possible for us. And we've just been kicked in the teeth by our oldest friend, our oldest partner, our neighbor, our friend. And because of that, it's just convulsed the political system. I think there's one implication that is clear, which is that the conservative, Pierre Poilievre, got his vote out. There's no question. His vote is very strong. But he lost because I think, on balance, Canadians thought he sounded much too much like a MAGA Republican. There was a kind of American whiff to his campaign that made him implausible as a combatant against Trump, whereas Carney struck a note which was more moderate, more cautious, more Canadian, but also equally intransigent.
I mean, just to look at the actual numbers for a moment, we don't have 100% of results yet, but pretty much. I think we're 98.5% at this point. It's fair to say that the Liberals, if anything, somewhat underperformed their polls. Looks like they got around 43.5% and will end up with 168 or 169 seats, so short of the majority that most of the betting money had them winning a majority today, and that didn't happen. Meanwhile, the Conservatives, if anything, overperformed their polls. Most of the final opinion polls were in the late 30s. Looks like they get 41, 42%. So really less than 2 percentage points between those two parties. And a big surge for the Conservatives still from where they were in the last Parliament. So although it's against expectations, it's important not to miss the bigger picture, which was that actually the Conservatives have really improved their position.
I think it's fair to say, with one little asterisk which you need to add, which is that the leader of the party is currently a couple thousand behind his Liberal challenger. And if he were to lose that seat, that's a huge blow to him and to the party. But you're quite right. The Conservatives have performed ahead of expectations, and the Liberals, in a way, have performed slightly below expectations. But it's still, I've done this business of politics, and the thing that is extraordinary about what Carney did was that he threw his hat in the ring when the party was 20 to 25 points back, and he turned that around so that the party has actually gained 15 seats or something, and will form a government. It's not the majority government he wanted, though. That's be clear. So it's a mitigated victory. It's a compromised victory in a sense, but it's still a victory, and power is power, and he will hold it and he will exercise it. The question is whether he'll be able to exercise it through a full parliament. If he doesn't have a majority, then it's likely that the government will be brought down short of the 5 years that it usually has, and that adds an element of instability, and it weakens his hand as he goes to deal with Trump.
The chart, of course, of the opinion polls in the past 12 months is quite extraordinary. From that very large advantage to the Conservatives, it just collapses over the past few months, roughly since the end of last year. And I guess there are three factors that you could put that down to. One is the departure of Trudeau, who had evidently become unpopular. Another is the arrival of Carney. But of course, the third is Donald Trump and all of his rhetoric around Canada, the tariffs and everything that was going on. How do you sort of apportion those three factors roughly in terms of explaining that huge change?
I think there was definite fatigue with Trudeau. He was perfect for 2015, and suddenly he was extremely irritating to many Canadians by 2025. He's a hell of a politician. I was leader when he was in the caucus, and it was clear that he would be leader one day, and he did he was extraordinary for one moment and then suddenly went past his sell-by date, and that's how politics works. So that's one factor. The second factor is I think Carney was both Trudeau's successor and also the anti-Trudeau, in the sense that all of the things that Carney projects, which are kind of quiet, stolid competence with a sharp bite of humor and some self-deprecation, played well as a contrast to Trudeau. But there's no question, if I have to rank the factors, the Trump factor is the overwhelming factor, because I think you have to appreciate the Canadian situation is just different than the situation of any other country, with the possible exception of Mexico. We're their neighbors, we're their friends. Someone like me did 15 years in the United States. I had my education in the States. I grew up to American rock and roll. I'm completely shaped by my American connection, as many Canadians are. And so suddenly to have an American president say, actually, we'd like to take you over, and you don't make any sense to us, and we could crush you economically if we wanted to. All that is just an existential challenge to our narratives, to our sense of ourselves. So I think that was the dominant factor. And I think that Poilievre was slow to understand that that was the ballot question. Carney was much faster to grasp that that was the way that he could win the election, and because he played that card hard, I think he got himself a government.
Do you think it's a shame, in a way, because the turbulence around Trump has now basically pushed off course something that maybe needed to happen? I heard you say in an earlier interview that you thought it might be a change election before all of this. I mean, what do you think would have been the best result for Canada?
Oh, look, I'm a liberal. I'm still I'm out of the game, but I've been liberal all my life, and so I'm happy with a liberal victory. But look, there's no doubt, and I've been saying this, the country faces one essential challenge, which is the economy is beginning to underperform the American economy in ways that are actually an existential challenge if it goes on. As many people have said, the unstated premise of Canada is that our standard of living will never be equal to the American, but it must kind of keep in step with it. As if that gap were to grow, more and more Canadians will simply leave, as they did in the 19th century. They'll leave, and suddenly the viability of our economy might come into question. And that's why we have to close that gap, and that's why a productivity agenda is at the center of what Carney has to do. And I think a lot of Canadians wanted to vote for change because they sense an economic malaise. There's no question the previous Liberal government failed to address that successfully. And so Carney has to try to do that. But, let's also be candid. What governments can do to address a productivity crisis of this seriousness is not unlimited. Government's power to change the overall productive capacity of an economy is not, we've got tools, but they're not unlimited. So it's going to be a chastening test of what's been cardinal for me, which is a liberal faith in government. Can government inspire a country to fix problems that we've had for 20, 30 years? And so that's the challenge. It's a big challenge for Carney.
I guess what the government can do is it can remove obstacles to economic growth and improvements in productivity. There's been talk, for example, of these interprovincial tariffs. There's a lot of talk about international tariffs at the moment, but actually within Canada, there's a lot of tariffs that are just adding weight to the economy. Poilievre was talking about that. It now turns out that Carney may be addressing that as well. Do you think that, in a way, Mark Carney has to learn from some of Poilievre's ideas about how to cut out some of the red tape in the Canadian economy?
I don't think there's any doubt that there's been a convergence between the liberal and conservative platforms. I think that's what you're picking up, and I think that's right. And one particular thing is I think Poilievre has had some useful ideas about corporate tax rates, for example, improving the investment, the incentives for investment. And I think Carney, like all politicians, will steal from his opponent and put that into play. And that's how politics works, and that's probably a good thing. If he's in a minority, I think one of the key challenges that he's got to think through is whether he goes to Poilievre and says, look, this is a national emergency we're in. Can we just, could we agree on a kind of, a common platform here? Or do I have to go to the Bloc Québécois, which is a separatist party, and make a deal with them? I think he'd much prefer to work with Poilievre. The question is whether Poilievre believes that's in his interest. As you know, in Britain, when parties combine in coalitions, the smaller party ends up getting eaten, and Poilievre will be aware that that's a danger. So the political system is going to be tested as to whether the two parties, conservative and liberal, could actually work together in some ways to address some of these long-term challenges.
That's a very interesting idea that I haven't heard discussed very much. You think they could almost be like a grand coalition or a sort of wartime style unity government in the face of these threats? How would that happen practically? Would we see that already in the coming days with phone calls between Carney and Poilievre, or do you think it would be more of a long-term accommodation?
Look, I'm privy to nothing here, although I'm a friend of Mark's and happy for his victory, but I have no idea what he's planning to do. It's just if I looked at these cards, being a couple of seats short of a majority, I would explore the possibility of whether there's cooperation with the Conservatives. If, for example, Poilievre was to lose his seat, that then puts the whole of the Conservative Party in kind of suspended animation until they can figure out what to do about the leadership problem. That would give Carney more time. But we're getting into details where I don't have mastery. And grand coalitions don't have a long history in Canada. So I think what is more likely is some kind of confidence and supply arrangement in Parliament so that Carney can get his budget through. He's very close to a majority, so he may feel he can do without grand coalitions. But my feeling is that if this is a national crisis, it's pretty important to find some way to talk to the Conservatives. And there's another reason for that, which is if you look at the distribution of the seats, the Conservatives are extremely strong in the West, and the Liberal Party is very weak in the West. And all of these choices about how to get the economy going depend on maintaining the national unity of the country. And so you need to reach across the aisle to bring the conservative voters over to a kind of national program. How you do that is the great challenge, I think, the central challenge of Carney's leadership in the years ahead.
Yeah, that would be very interesting, though. I mean, he came to England as governor during that coalition government where the Conservatives reached across to the Liberal Democrats. Perhaps he'll be taking inspiration from that. Let's just move on for a moment. I think it's important not to let the Trudeau era off the hook in all this excitement. And I know it's kind of difficult for you as a former Liberal Party leader, but as you say, you are at liberty to say whatever you like these days. You're hardly taking the whip. Where did Trudeau go so wrong? I mean, it feels like the so-called woke obsessions, minority, gender stuff, a focus on race to the exclusion of more practical issues, pretty much cost him a lot of popularity. Would you agree with that? Where do you think he went wrong?
Well, I think Carney's analysis would be that he neglected the economy. He neglected the fundamentals of Canadian prosperity and watched a productivity gap open with the United States that he failed to put front and center, and instead tacked left to deal with a lot of issues that are important in our country, Aboriginal issues for one thing, inclusion of women, another big subject. But the effect of that was to tilt him off the center of Canadian politics, and Carney is trying to bring us back into the center and focus the country on the economic agenda. And I think he's basically right about that. It's a focus then on the pocketbook issues where I think Trudeau is increasingly vulnerable. I think there are also some personal issues. Trudeau was, and I watched him because I campaigned with him, is an unbelievable retail politician. He lands every jump, he sticks every landing. He's always on message, always on point. His skill set were, in excess of mine by a factor of 10. And the irony is that people got fed up with it. The performance began to grate and irritate people, and he awoke irritation that was, I think, far in excess of his failings. I mean, I just think people got fed up with him personally in a way that is an interesting, tragic, comic kind of aspect of politics. He was done in other words, by the very qualities that got him elected in the first place.
Is that not to let him off the hook on some of the more substantial things? I mean, one remembers the COVID era, for example. A lot of people were really shocked by, the measures that were taken against people who weren't happy with some of the COVID measures, the trucker protests, shutting down people's bank accounts, all of that. That really sharpened the minds, certainly in the international observer world, of just how kind of almost fundamentalist he was at times when he didn't like what he was seeing. Is that not a legitimate critique of Trudeau, and that we shouldn't really just say it's all about style? He got carried away.
I don't know about that. I side with those who favored strong measures on COVID. Strong public health measures. I'm unsympathetic to the idea that he was kind of draconian and too tough. I was unconvinced by the truckers, and I felt that the truckers took their free speech and their protest rights to the limit of what the public order of any society can stand. I'd in fact think that I think he was wrong to make this a matter of using the emergency powers. I think there I would agree with you. He went too far. I take that point, because what was needed was simple, effective police action, and that's what eventually dispersed the truckers. But having your capital city immobilized for 3 weeks and not being able to get that done with effective police action wasn't in fact his fault. It was the fact of the Ottawa police, but that's another matter. But on your basic question, which is that he went too far on COVID, I'd respectfully disagree.
Donald Trump, the president of this enormous country next to Canada, has talked about Canada becoming the 51st state, as well as the whole up and down tariffs, which is very destabilizing and I'm sure frightening for Canadians. What's your view on this 51st state question? I mean, is there any way in which it could actually happen?
I think there's one way. I don't see tanks crossing the 49th parallel. I just don't think that even Trump would have reason to hesitate about that. I think what is possible and what is sinister is that he could decide, I'm going to use all the economic measures that I have to cripple the Canadian dollar, to cripple Canada's capacity to export. He constantly says we don't really need anything from Canada, and therefore we could shut it all down and really expose the economy to extreme pressure. If it does that, then the only scenario in which I can see, us becoming the 51st state, and let me be clear, this is, this awakens horror in me and opposition in me. The only scenario in which it's possible is if, in a state of economic quarantine, Canadians decide, look, the price of our survival is just too high, and we need to support annexation. But I find it hard to imagine that circumstance. I deplore the very idea that we're talking about it. I don't want to encourage it. But that's the only scenario in which I can see that Canada could be forcibly made to become the 51st state. And it's a very interesting question because Canada, I think a lot of Europeans find Canada a little hard to understand. We look like the Americans, we sound like the Americans, we talk like Americans, we root for the same, baseball teams and football teams, and yet we're ineradicably convinced that we're not Americans, and we never will be Americans. And this insistence on a difference, despite substantial economic integration, has been the condition of our existence for 150 years, and we want to hold on to it. The new factor is suddenly that the economic integration that we based our identity on and our sovereignty on is suddenly in question. And so this is the central challenge of Carney's time as a prime minister, and that's why the country's given him the mandate.
And your example there of how, what scenario might be most plausible does imply that America still has huge power to cripple Canada's economy if it so chooses. In a way that's different from the rhetoric we hear from Mark Carney, which is all like plucky, I'm going in there, almost like two equals, I'm going to fight back to Trump. We've got other friends, we can do deals with Europe, we can do this and that. But your implication is the reality is Carney basically will have to go and plea for mercy to President Trump.
No, I wouldn't go as far as that. I don't think he has to plea for mercy. He will make a couple of points very clear. Because he's a central banker, he will know a lot about the U.S. Treasury market, and he will know that one of the levers that really works on U.S. policymakers is if Carney works with the Japanese, the British, the Europeans to begin to sell treasuries, put real pressure on the treasury market. That kind of stuff can then start a market route which is definitely going to stop Trump in his tracks and has already stopped him once after his Liberation Day. So Carney has cards to play, and unlike almost any politician I can think of, he knows the details of how to play that card. That's one thing. The second thing is that despite what Trump says, we export a lot of absolutely central commodities, everything from potash to critical minerals to oil and gas. And those are cards that Carney will play to the maximum. The real problem, it seems to me, is that we can diversify. If our integration of the United States is now in question, we can diversify to the Far East, to Europe. We can develop new markets. But all of this takes time, and the problem that Carney has is he's got a couple of mandates. He hasn't got the time to see this diversification through to produce more resilience, more independence to the U.S. market. That's the vulnerability. The vulnerability can be fixed, but it takes time that Carney doesn't have. That's I think, the issue that he has to face.
Your first idea there is another very interesting one. It's almost the kind of nightmare of the populists, that the central bankers, the high technocrats unite and use these kind of dark arts of the bond markets to overrule the democratically elected figures like Donald Trump. I mean, what you're painting there, and it's plausible, I suppose, would be the populist stereotype of exactly what Carney might be.
Well, look, I just think this is how the international economy works. You can conjure up specters of these sinister elites, but in fact, all of our savings, all of our pensions, everything is dependent on that market, and we all need to know how it operates. And I think we're lucky to have a prime minister who actually does understand how it works all the way down. And frankly, if you're faced with someone wielding a club, and the president is wielding a very large club, you better go into that meeting with another club. I mean, this is not nice stuff. This is high politics at the nastiest and toughest level. Canada's not used to playing with a club, but we're going to have one. And I'm unapologetic about using the U.S. Treasury market if it comes to it.
Do you think there could be real geopolitical shifts now? And do you think Carney could be part of that? For example, I've heard discussed the idea that there could be an EU++ type of arrangement where Canada could actually join a kind of formal trading arrangement with the European Union and possibly the UK. It feels more plausible that the UK could be part of it if Canada was as well, as a kind of team to gang up against Trump kind of arrangement. Do you think that's plausible, or do you think that's far-fetched?
I think it's plausible, except that the Atlantic Ocean is a very large body of water, and geography is a very set of stubborn facts that every political leader has to take into account. I don't think there's any question that Canada will want to develop and extend its already pretty considerable cultural affinities, economic links with Europe, and those, I think, can be built. But again, the problem is time. I mean, just to give you one example, Canada could be a very substantial exporter of oil and gas to Europe to compensate for what I hope will be a permanent cut to dependence on Russian fuels. But again, we don't have the capacity to do that now. It's a 10-year project to get us in the possibility of becoming a supplier to Europe. This is the kind of structural change we need to make in the economy for the kind of alliances, the kind of connections you're talking about to become a reality. It's one thing to sign a relationship deal with the EU or various countries like the United Kingdom, but getting that to translate into real economic numbers is just going to take a number of years. And the crucial battleground period with Trump is between now and 2026. I mean, it's the next, 18 months. And then we can look at, and I'm sure Mr. Carney is thinking about this, we can look at a president who faces substantial reversals in the 2026 mid congressional elections, and that then weakens Mr. Trump's hand, and that then gives greater leverage to his opponents. So it's playing now that's the key, and getting those clubs ready for the negotiations now that I think are crucial.
Final question for you, Michael, and I guess this is a bit more of a philosophical one, big picture. The battle, it seems at the moment, at the broadest level, is between a kind of internationalist liberalism with a tendency towards technocratic means and a much more nationalistic populism trying to reclaim power at a national level and really rejecting some of the globalization we've seen in recent decades. I would normally posit you as being part of the liberal internationalist group. You're teaching at the Central European University, which is a Soros project. It's very much part of that worldview. Do you see it that way, that there's a kind of liberal internationalists versus the national populists, and you hope that the liberal internationalists win? Or do you think liberal internationalism needs to change to accommodate the needs of populist voters? I wish I had more people talking like that.
Vaste question, as Charles de Gaulle used to say when he was trying to buy time. It is the central question. I think my answer is that liberal internationalists like myself, and I am one, and I teach human rights, for example, I've always believed in that very flawed international order we created after 1945, because I think it made the world a better and safer place. But look, I don't think you can have a politics, a liberal politics, any kind of politics, that doesn't put your country first. I mean, the one thing I learned from being in Canadian politics, and I wasn't the greatest success, I in fact was a pretty resounding failure, but one thing I learned is that all politics is local, all politics is national. You have to speak to and get a democratic mandate from the people who live in a specific place with a specific history, a specific culture, a specific set of fears and hopes, and you got to speak to those. Liberal internationalism is not an effective politics at the national level. Liberal internationalism is good at creating the kind of global order that keeps nation states from killing each other. But democratic politics has to be and can only be national. And political authority in the modern world can't be given to you by Davos or the UN. It has to be given by the hardworking citizens of your own country. That's why I went into politics, and I loved that experience, even though it didn't turn out so well for me. And I'm glad that, Carney, having been a kind of liberal globalist, has, thrown his hat into the ring, gone and shaken a lot of hands, done the difficult work of democratic politics. I'm absolutely unapologetic, in other words, about a liberalism that is patriotic, that is nationalist in the sense of understanding that democratic legitimacy comes from a people with a history and a culture that has to be respected. And I think one of the real significances of the Canadian election is that what aroused Canadian fury was the idea that the president would come in and presume to tell us how to run our own affairs. We just thought, hell no. And I can't agree more with my fellow citizens.
Michael Ignatieff, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Pleasure.
That was Michael Ignatieff, whose biography almost reads like the definitive member of the liberal elite. His father was at the United Nations. His grandfather was a Russian aristocrat in the final court of the Tsar as education minister. He lives in Canada. He spent time in the UK, in America, at all of the elite institutions. He is an intellectual. He's written biographies of the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He had a brief stint as leader of the Liberal Party in Canada. As he said himself, it was not especially successful. And now he is teaching at the Central European University in Vienna, which itself is designed to push the so-called open society of George Soros. So in a way, he's the perfect guy who should be defending the liberal international order and just thinking of the result we had overnight as a victory for that and hurrah, one down to Team Trump. What I thought was so interesting was that he wasn't talking like that. He was actually saying that the so-called liberal internationalists need to accept that democracy provides political authority, that local, specific peoples need to give their leaders authority, and that liberal internationalism is not a democratic mandate-giving way of thinking. I thought that was an interesting concession. And actually, although he didn't endorse Poilievre or even close, he was talking about the need for change and that the Conservatives had some interesting ideas. Even threw up the idea of a grand coalition there, which I haven't heard other people talking about. It would be interesting if that does happen. As ever, you heard it here first. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.